Well, my hope is that all parties will come together and to identify what is the best path forward to not take away a tool that donors have themselves decided they like and they want. No one has to give to a donor advised fund. The fact that there are millions of families who are choosing to create a donor advised fund, I think is indication enough that we're on to something, that this is something that really donors value. And in all the time, and it took me over 12 months to write this book, I didn't think it would take that long, but I kept interviewing more and more people.
You're listening to the Nonprofit Counsel Podcast with host May Harris.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Counsel Podcast. I'm May Harris, and today joining me is a prolific author, Ted Hart, whose most recent book is The DAF Revolution. Welcome to the podcast, Ted.
Thank you, May, for inviting me.
My pleasure. So let's start with you telling us a little bit about what prompted you to kind of enter into the nonprofit space and what's the genesis for your involvement.
Oh, well, that's quite a history going back a few decades.
It usually is for people, like us. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've been in the nonprofit sector my entire career. I actually started before I graduated from college. There was a member of the board of directors of a charity that I guess said he saw something in me and that I should give nonprofits a try. So that they actually hired me 6 months before I graduated. And I really liked it. I enjoyed the work, the opportunity, as I saw it, an opportunity for people to do great work and to be involved with activities that maybe their day-to-day lives didn't allow them to be involved with causes that they really truly care about. If they could, they might quit their jobs and go off and help other people, but that's not a possibility. So I think nonprofits fill that void for a lot of people, where the work that you're doing is actually something that people want to inspire to have happen, whether they're doing that with their volunteer time or with their own resources.
Right. So let's move forward to your first book, which wasn't the DAF Revolution. The DAF Revolution is your latest book, but tell me about your first book. What got you into that?
First book was Fundraising on the Internet that I wrote actually 6 months before September 11. It was published by Wiley, and so it was already in the hopper, but came out just after September 11, and it looked like we were, soothsayers of some sort, that suddenly what people were debating, that the internet would ever be used for fundraising, suddenly it became something that everybody was trying to learn about. And so Fundraising on the Internet was my first book. It was very, very successful. And then I went on, as you know, my eighth book just came out September 3rd, and that's The DAF Revolution, Making a Difference in Our Modern World.
Really, really awesome. So tell me a little bit about why the DAF Revolution. Why is that your focus? Because DAFs are an interesting thing. So for those of our listeners who might not know really what a DAF is, it's a donor advised fund. So, kind of removes the necessity of going out and starting your own nonprofit organization and all the rigmarole and paperwork and craziness and compliance that you would have if you went that route. A DAF is much simpler. So what was the impetus to do this book?
Well, donor advised funds are the fastest growing form of philanthropy ever. And there's over $250 billion in donor advised funds right now. Donor advised funds hit their first $100 billion in 30 years. It took private foundations over 100 years to reach that magnitude. It's hard to know exactly how many DAF accounts there are, but the estimation is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million accounts. So a lot of Americans find donor advised funds, as you said, to really meet them where they want to be. And that is the ability to make a donation today, but maybe I don't know where I want that money to go. Maybe I have an income event of some sort. Maybe I sold my company. Maybe it's the end of the year and I really do want that tax deduction so that I can, make sure that my taxes are in order before the end of the year. But that's really a tough time for people to make decisions about where they would like that money to go. Donor advised funds really are that solution where we separate the ability to make the contribution and then the timeliness of being able to either make contributions at times of emergency, or maybe to, as many people do, they'll use donor advised funds to save for their golden retirement years where they still want to be generous, but they don't have as much income. So they'll give away their money from their donor advised funds in their retirement years. Or maybe they're planning for multi-generation where they're giving money now, but they want to involve their children and grandchildren. And the flexibility of donor advised funds allows all of those scenarios to be able to work.
Absolutely. With a lot less paperwork and scrutiny, because really whoever is hosting or the donor advised funds, they're the ones who are reporting out to the IRS
right.
and charity regulators, and they have the obligation to invest it wisely. And
right.
when you pull it all together, it can be, a win-win across the board.
That's right. That's right. As we shared, I'll just share what the book looks like.
There it is.
DAF Revolution, Making a Difference in Our Modern World. There are 4 audiences that this book is written for, and there are actually chapters set aside for each audience. So first of all, of course, donors, those who make all the magic possible by giving either of cash or appreciated assets. And for a lot of donors, donor advised funds are really the way that they can make contributions of appreciated assets, which means they now qualify for 2 tax deductions. They'll avoid capital gains on that appreciated asset, and they'll get the charitable tax deduction as well. But a lot of nonprofit organizations are not really prepared or don't have the skill set to be able to turn those illiquid assets, oftentimes, those appreciated assets, into cash on a timely basis. Whereas many donor advised funds, both large and small donor advised funds, do have that capacity to turn that into cash and make it available for nonprofit organizations. And the donor is able to maintain those advisory rights. And the wonderful thing about donor advised funds is that they are giving away many multiples of their assets compared to private foundations. So your listeners may or may not know that private foundations are required by law to give away 5% of their assets each year. Unfortunately, when that law was set in 1969 and then the percentage was set in the 1970s, it was never meant to be a ceiling. However, private foundations today only give slightly more than that, 5%. Donor advised funds, on the other hand, don't have a requirement for payouts, and they're giving multiples of that, between 15 and 25% of their assets on an annual basis, because donors are giving as they want to give, as opposed to meeting an artificial number set by the federal government.
Right. Well, to hold a DAF or a donor advised fund, it's a public charity, exempt under 501c3, just like a private foundation, but the rules are so much less stringent and draconian in many ways. So, you mentioned something that I'd like to circle back to, which is, sponsors of donor advised funds can be small to big. I mean, Fidelity Charitable is the behemoth in the space, of course.
Largest charity ever.
Absolutely. But there are community foundations, local organizations that run DAFs in their communities. So it's not like a donor must go to the big guys, must go to Fidelity Charitable, must go to, an investment house. There's, in San Diego where, we're headquartered, there's the San Diego Foundation, there's the Rancho Santa Fe Foundation, and a handful of others. And so I think to your point, donor advised funds can meet a donor wherever they are for whatever kind of, giving they want to be impactful for.
Yeah. And in the book, another category that we write for are advisors, philanthropic advisors. And in that chapter, we outline that there are 3 different types of donor advised funds. One of which is the one that a lot of folks think of. That's the national firms. And there are some very large national firms, and they're very efficient, and they offer a lot of value for their donors. And that's why so many donors turn to large national firms, because that's the value that they're looking for. But it's estimated that there's over 1,000 donor advised funds across the country, and they come in 2 other forms. One that you mentioned are community foundations. And the San Diego Foundation actually does set some standards for donor advised funds, so much so I have them included in the DAF Revolution with a case study from the San Diego Foundation. So very impressed.
They've been incredibly impactful in the community. 100%.
Yeah, very, very impressed with them. And so they are in the book, the DAF Revolution. The third type of DAF are mission-based or single issue, which might be religious-based. So there's a whole category of charities that have very specific reasons to exist, and that is that they may bring to the charities that they fund a certain lens, whether that is an environmental lens. It might be a single charity. It might be just a university that has its own donor advised fund, or it may be religious based. And so all three types of donor advised funds are extremely important to the entire ecosystem because they do provide donors with lots of different options. And donors don't have to just choose one. They can start in one place. They can advise their money from one DAF to another DAF. So if the needs that they have change, perhaps they started a national DAF, but then find that they really want to focus on their local community, and their local community foundation, it really serves that purpose. Or maybe it's their religious-based values that they want to be articulated in all of their grant making, and so they turn to a donor advised fund that meets that standard as well.
Well, let me ask you this question. So, for organizations that formed as a private foundation, it made sense at the time. They've now wound down their corpus enough, or they haven't been great about investing or anything. Is DAF kind of a good way for them to go?
It's a growing option, and it's one that I mentioned in the book, is that, there's a period of time where first of all, the donor advised funds were not as prevalent as they are today. They really only became a thing, even though they started in 1931. Most of that period of time since 1931, nobody really heard of donor advised funds, and it was difficult to find one. It wasn't until 1990s and then 2000s where all of the various regulations and rules and technology, all those tumblers came into play that now allow donor advised funds to really be the efficient vehicles that they are today. So in looking at that ecosystem, what we've found is that there is a lot more opportunity today than there ever has been before.
Right. So in that situation, let's just kind of walk our listeners through, either they're a new donor or they're a private foundation that's like, we're done with the 990 PFs. We want to just be done with this. How would they approach a donor advised fund and setting up a donor advised fund? I've assisted in this, but I'm interested in your perspective.
Okay.
It's all contractual. It's,
That's right.
And it varies by different funds. So, shop around a little bit, in my opinion.
Shop around it. Absolutely, because each donor advised fund sets its own rules. There are standards. So Chapter 2 of the book really outlines what are those regulatory standards. Chapter 4 are the best practices for donor advised funds, large and small. So we pull back that curtain so that any donor can really know, what can you expect from your donor advised fund, and what are the questions that you should be asking? Maybe anonymity really matters to you. Not all donor advised funds offer that. Most do. Understanding their policies. So you would raise this question of private foundations maybe transferring their assets into a DAF. That is a growing trend, and one that I cover in the book, because there was a period of time before donor advised funds where if you really wanted to have structured philanthropy, you kind of had to start a private foundation, and it's always been expensive, and it's always had a lot of regulatory compliance that you had to meet. And maybe it was a little bit prestigious at that point, and maybe today it still is, but you've got to have so much money to have your private foundation really make a difference. What many smaller private foundations are finding is that transferring all of those assets into a donor advised funds allows them now to do what they set out to do, and that's be philanthropists and not necessarily have to worry about all of the management of their money, because now they've made that the donor advised fund sponsor, which, as you mentioned, is always a 501c3 nonprofit organization. They now take on all the responsibility of managing those funds.
Okay, so let's walk our listeners through the next step. So we've identified a sponsor, we've signed the agreement, we've transferred the money. Now what? Yeah,
well, you don't have to wait until now what, but let's talk about now what. Really to think about what is it that you want to accomplish. And as I mentioned earlier, there's so many different options, and all of them are absolutely valid. So maybe you want to open your donor advised fund just to manage your annual giving. And it's a great way to keep all of your tax receipts in the same place. It's a great, one-stop shop. Most donor advised funds have a portal that you can go to. So you can really click and give. And that's a very easy way for folks to give. Maybe what you want to do is make your contribution over the next several years and invest it over that time. And many donor advised funds allow you to not only advise on grants, but also advise on how those funds are invested within certain parameters, because obviously they're still in a charitable space. So there's lots of rules around how investments can be managed. But again, the funds are owned by that donor advised fund. So they're going to advise you on what's possible and what's not.
Well, and you also mentioned, and donors and clients of mine, when they want to open up a DAF, they kind of just want to know what availability there is for their children, their grandchildren to become involved. So you mentioned it, I think earlier, generational philanthropy.
That's right.
And I really like DAFs for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great way to use DAFs. And in the book, there's a lot that's covered about how to structure that and how to engage younger donors or younger advisors to teach them how to be philanthropic. And much of what philanthropy is about values. What is it that you value? What do you want society to look for? And you have a little bit of extra cash that you'd like to do something good with. Mm-hmm. And that's what a donor advised fund can allow you to do. But many of us would like to think that our children and grandchildren, and maybe even other generations beyond that, will have the resources to be able to also do good. And that's a wonderful thing about donor advised funds. Most donor advised funds allow you to name successors and to set up a protocol for how successor advisors will be chosen. The default is always, if there is no advisor, the default is the board of directors of that donor advised fund. But make sure that you understand what are the policies of the donor advised fund that you're working with, because they're not all the same.
Right. So we've spent some time talking about the good things about DAFs. So, maybe our listeners know, DAFs do have some kind of criticism around it. When you mentioned Fidelity Charitable is the largest charity in the world, that's a lot of money that's held up in one grant-making organization that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So I think that's one primary criticism. Maybe you can respond to that, and maybe other criticisms that you know of regarding DAFs.
Well, I cover them all in the book. The book is not meant to be a critique or necessarily just a supporter of donor advised funds. It's meant to provide donors, advisors, and nonprofit organizations the opportunity to see all issues and to make decisions for themselves. So that's why it's seen as the first comprehensive book on donor advised funds ever written, because it covers all of that. And I've interviewed for the book over 120 experts throughout the philanthropic world, including Ray Madoff, who is affectionately known as one of the biggest critics of donor advised funds. And she's quoted in the book as well. And I think she really provided incredible insights into what she is most concerned about. And I think the answers that a lot of donor advised funds have today are much more enlightening than maybe they were a decade ago. So I think her criticism was much more pointed a decade ago. And most donor advised funds have really listened to that criticism and do now have standards for giving. They have policies in place so that accounts do not become inactive for long periods of time. So a lot of the critiques that have, I think, been very valid about donor advised funds are really hard to place today.
Well, that's an interesting kind of way to look at it. I think the evolution and the use of donor advised funds has emerged a lot more quickly than regulations. The IRS is still, processing how they want to treat it. And it sounds like even the criticisms are a little bit delayed as well. So how do you foresee the IRS's regulations and, kind of DAFs into the future?
Yeah. Well, my hope is that all parties will come together and to identify what is the best path forward to not take away a tool that donors have themselves decided they like and they want. No one has to give to a donor advised fund. The fact that there are millions of families who are choosing to create a donor advised fund, I think is indication enough that we're on to something, that this is something that really donors value. And in all the time, and it took me over 12 months to write this book, I didn't think it would take that long, but I kept interviewing more and more people. And even though I ran a donor advised fund and grew it considerably over a 12-year period, I knew a little bit about donor advised funds. I can tell you in writing this book, I learned as much as I knew. There's that much nuance about donor advised funds. And I really think that the fact that donors are using them at higher rates must tell us the donors want to be generous. They want to be able to have the opportunity to advise their giving. but they don't want to have to take on all the responsibility of managing a private foundation.
I couldn't agree more. I think my primary criticism really is just that's a lot of money that has been tax advantaged now.
Yeah.
So how can we ensure, and you already mentioned one of those things, which is, they're not allowing those kind of fallow DAFs to just sit there, which is critical.
Yeah, most donor advised funds today do have policies in place that if a grant is not made in a certain period of time, they're going to be actively involved with that advisor, encouraging them to give, and ultimately may start making grants themselves if the donor is not available or can't be found or is not willing to do that. And that's why it's important, if that bothers you in any way or you're concerned about what those policies are like, it's good to ask those questions up front, because not every DAF is the same. But most DAFs today do have an active account policies of one sort or another. But I think in terms of where do we have the real problem in philanthropy, I have to say the fact that there's over $1 trillion sitting in private foundations, only granting about 6% or a little more than 6% each year.
Just enough not to get in trouble, right?
Right. Well, they're meeting the obligation. However, that obligation was set not meaning to be a ceiling, but meant to be a floor, that would be the minimum, not the maximum that private foundations would give. But now it's very difficult to find a trustee of a private foundation who doesn't feel that it's their fiduciary responsibility to keep grant making within the range of 5%. They certainly could give 15, 20%. There's absolutely no rule against a private foundation giving 15 or 20% of their money each year. Turn to donor advised funds, where there's about $250 billion, much less sitting in donor advised funds, who are granting whatever that number may be. It is many multiples of 50 or 5%. So whether it's 15% or 20%, it is more than 5%, because there isn't a rule that people are playing to. They're playing to their own philanthropic intent. And what that means is people give at higher rates when they're not told how to give.
That's so important. Well, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners? Any gems, any, advice that you could share?
There's a lot of gems in the book. Chapter 8 is the final chapter. And as I went through each of the chapters, one chapter is written for donor advised funds. Chapter 5 is written for advisors. Chapter 6 is the nonprofit guide to donor advised funds, giving concrete ways that they can get more money from donor advised funds, even though they may be frustrated that they can't straight up just send a grant proposal to a donor advised fund. And that is very frustrating, but a DAF strategy is needed by every nonprofit to get more money from.
What kind of DAF strategy do you recommend for nonprofits? It's not just a hope for something, right?
It's not a hope. No, it's not a hope. There's actually 10 strategies that are outlined in chapter 6 of the book that cover a whole gamut of everything from major gift relationship fundraising to preparing yourself and making sure that you are able to receive grants from a donor advised fund. So I really encourage nonprofits to really read chapter 6 and put their strategy together, because 2026 could be a much bigger year for them if they really embrace all 10 of those strategies. And then chapter 7 is about grant making internationally, and donor advised funds are a great resource for anyone who might want to receive a U.S. tax deduction, but be able to support charities around the world. So we get to chapter 8, and the 120 plus experts that I interviewed for the book, I refer to them as the DAF 120. And I see them as the premier experts of donor advised funds throughout the country and around the world. And in chapter 8, they give us a look to the future of what the future looks like and what really needs to be the focus for all donor advised funds, donors, and advisors. And you'll be happy to know, since you've raised this topic and it's a big part of the work that you do, the number one topic are next generations of donors.
I think that's awesome. Something that you said just took me flashback to when I was a development director 20 years ago and got a check out of the mail from a donor advised fund. And I remember thinking this was the best thing ever. But how cool that you have offered some strategies for nonprofit organizations to be proactive and strategic in how they can access this vast amount of funding.
Yeah, and not only just strategies, but also case studies of nonprofits who have succeeded.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ted. It has been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for being a guest on the Nonprofit Counsel Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Nonprofit Counsel Podcast. Are you ready to lead with clarity and confidence? Head to nonprofitcounsel.com to find the tools you need to start smart, lead strong, and create lasting impact.